First though, here on RTE Radio 1, it's The Leap of Faith. And here is Michael Comyn.
Hello and welcome to The Leap of Faith. Well, he's making a list and checking it twice. He's going to find out who's naughty or nice, an idea that's been used by parents to encourage better behaviour in the countdown to Christmas for many years now. But the theory of our behaviour being monitored by a supreme being is familiar to most religions. On the programme tonight, we'll discuss where we source our ethical values in an increasingly diverse and secularised society. Joining me to discuss this are Professor Linda Hogan, Chair of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin. Linda has extensive experience in research and teaching in pluralist and multi-religious contexts. Her primary research interests lie in intercultural and interreligious ethics, social and political ethics, human rights and gender. Also with us is Christopher Cowley, Associate Professor, School of Philosophy at University College Dublin and a member of the Newman Centre for the Study of Religion. Christopher studied philosophy in London, Montreal and Bristol. And among his writings and essays, I came across the rather exciting question, do all of us have the genuine capacity to be saints and heroes? Also with us this evening, writer Michael Nugent, chairperson of the advocacy group Atheist Ireland, which was formed to promote atheism, reason and ethical secularism in Ireland and around the world. Michael's writing ranges from satire to serious and includes the hit comedy musical play I, Keno, written with his insight as an ardent football fan. You're all very welcome. Michael Nugent, can I start with you? Can we be good without God?
Well, of course we can. We can also be bad without God, and we can be good with God and bad with God in terms of ideas in our minds. I think morality has evolved in the brains of social animals, including human and non-human animals, because cooperation and competition are both useful for the survival of the species. And so we see in both human and non-human animals attributes such as, at the base level, compassion and empathy, and then moving towards cooperation and reciprocity. And then as upper level primates and humans evolve the ability to rationally think things through, we see ideas such as fairness and justice coming into play. So that's how morality evolved. But what we have with religion is an extra layer that corrupts that natural morality. So you have people believing that the creator of the universe is telling them to trump that natural morality with commands that have nothing to do with empathy or compassion or reciprocity or cooperation or fairness or justice. So you get books telling us to, such as the Christian Bible, saying to stone a man to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And you have the Quran saying to flog adulterers and don't let your compassion stop you from doing so. And so those things, we intuitively know that they're wrong. So religious people today tend to go, well, okay, those things are wrong, but there's a lot of good stuff as well. But the key thing in that is that by making that distinction, you're applying your own morality to those religious commands. You're not getting your morality from them.
But the dilemma I have in listening to your explanation is that as an atheist, you're actually commenting on your fellow humans who are making these conclusions, not a deity or a god.
Exactly, yeah. The gods only exist in our minds. It's humans, and not only humans. I personally, as a vegan, I extend my empathy and compassion to non-human animals. Like I would operate on the basis of an extension of John Rawls' social contract theory, which is that you should try to figure out what would, in theory, you can't do this in reality, what would a perfectly rational set of people come up with as ways to govern society if they didn't know where within that society they would be. They didn't know whether to be male or female, rich or poor, healthy or ill. And I would add to that, we shouldn't know what species we'd be. And then we'd come up with a very different moral set of values.
Professor Logan, in 2021, as we move into 2022, is there room for the religious voice in public life and even legislation?
So I think there certainly is room for the religious voice as one, or religious voices as voices amongst the pluralist value system, representing the pluralist value systems that we have today. And I would say that, in many respects, I agree with Michael when he says that, you don't need a God to be good, you don't need a God to be bad, you can be an atheist and be good, and an atheist and be bad as well. I think religion is an interpretive framework that is evident in many different cultures, that is not so much a corrupting, I would say, of natural morality, but it is an interpretation, or there are different interpretations of the kinds of values and moralities, some of which we can draw from our experience in the natural world, and other parts of our morality which have evolved as we have developed different forms of societies, different forms of cooperation. So I don't personally see a sharp binary between religion on the one hand and other forms of creeds or beliefs on the other. I think all of us inhabit a worldview where we have a set of values and orientations, some of which are picked up from our culture, some of which are in opposition to our culture. And as individuals, we try and make sense of those and try and understand what it is to live a good life. And in that context, religious people have a role to play articulating their values in a pluralist world and in a pluralist country, in the same way as those who don't have a religious tradition, but who have other convictions and you might say even articles of faith. So I don't see it as a binary, but I do see it as absolutely vital that we have a space for that pluralist conversation. And I do not believe that any religion, should have a privileged place around a table or any table in terms of their articulation of a set of values.
But for people of a religious belief, a religious persuasion, they might believe that they are being slowly excluded from that conversation.
Well, I think that, if you look historically, you can say that we have moved from a position of where only a very small number of voices were heard. They were generally Catholic, male, of a certain class, and what we have, I think, is a broadening of the field of discourse to include many excluded voices, and including those who come from religious points of view but whose tradition never represented their views or their voices when they were around the table or in the debate. And I would say, for example, if you look at how the conversation about Catholic ethics got conveyed in Ireland over many decades, how many Catholic women's voices were heard in that conversation? None, probably. I do think that there has been a broadening of that field of discourse, and that is a very good thing. And so if there are certain voices that had been dominating, that now have to make the case for themselves, then I think that that's a good thing.
Christopher Cowley, there's a phrase I came across from Seneca, one of the philosophers, saying that religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. What was he talking about those couple of 100,000 years ago even?
Well, there's always a difference between the meaning of the religious claims and their effect in society, and how they can be useful for organising people, for making them more obedient. I'm assuming here we're having a conversation about the role of religion among sincere people and not among sincere politicians. What I would say is religion is not the only discourse. There are other discourses. It is a discourse that allows us to make sense of a lot of problems in the world, a lot of mysteries in the world, and as a source of reassurance in moments of catastrophe, moments of misfortune. And there it is an interpretive framework, as Linda says, that it really is one of many frameworks, and one that is useful in that very personal sense, not useful in the political sense.
It's also interesting, and I'd open this to all three of you, but the idea too that where on the one hand, if we're looking at religious versus secular, religion provides for many people the concept of forgiveness. we can apparently, if we are in a position to confess and to make amends to our God, be absolved of our sins. Michael Nugent, we don't get that in the same way in the secular world, do we?
Well, you do. You just don't attribute it to a supernatural being. You know, I mean, I've forgiven a lot of people for the things that they've done. People have forgiven me for things that I've done. It doesn't require any supernatural being. And see, I think a lot of religious people seem to believe that their framework is the only way to, or certainly the primary way to look at it, and everybody else has to justify how they can do these things. But actually, secularism and atheism and humanism have all been found, for example, by the European Court of Human Rights to be philosophical convictions that are worthy of respect in a democratic society, and that have the same protections as religious beliefs. So it's not a case that you have religion on one hand and everybody else has to explain how they come up with morality. It's we're all moral beings. To whatever degree we are concerned about maximising the well-being of sentient beings and minimising the suffering of sentient beings. Now, where we believe that comes from is a separate issue, but it's not the default that it comes from religion and everybody else has to justify where they get it from.
Christopher, if that voice that a person hears in their head, they attribute to a conscious or consciences, is that them as a human, or could that be a divine inspiration or God?
It will be different for different people. I just might take one issue with this thought that religion is essentially corrupting. Religion can enhance one's understanding of the world. So if I have a voice in my head, it's possible that I can say, I'm mad. It's possible I can say, it's the devil talking to me, or it's God talking to me. Now, all of these are, again, interpretative frameworks. One advantage about the organized religions, the major religions, is that they have a discourse of equality that's very profound. So the central idea of loving one's neighbor as oneself, that is a very powerful religious idea. And this is a way of making sense of interhuman relations. Here I am, I bump into somebody, intuitively I don't like them. And yet I remind myself that they are a fellow child of God. There's one religious expression. And then that brings me to see them in a new light and reminds me that I do have a duty to love my neighbor. I'm not in a position to go with my intuitive distance, my intuitive distaste for this person when I first meet them. And that when we look at the language of human rights, for example, this is still a profoundly religious idea. This is originally a very new idea that people are created equal, that people owe each other equal respect. Even though that has become a secular idea, we should remember the religious resonances in this. And this it requires some sense, some modesty, some accepting oneself as part of a much larger whole, not just the world, but the universe, that may have a larger order than we can comprehend.
Linda, if we were to look at then the development of that particular idea, I mean, we've just heard the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which apparently predates Christ's teaching by 500 years. Who has it right?
Well, I wouldn't want to say sort of one tradition has it right and another hasn't, or one had it first and the other has it later. I think, as Christopher has explained, really the ideas and convictions that we have in terms of how to live an ethical life come from many different tributaries in intellectual history, in religious history, in through the sort of lives and practice of ordinary people in different historical contexts. So I think many people and many traditions have come to similar conclusions, but not for the same reasons. And also, influenced by each other. As I think the point that Christopher made about the relationship between Christian ideals or Judeo-Christian ideals and the language of human rights is, and indeed many of the principles of secularism, of liberalism, is a very important one. There is no, I think if you look at the history of this, there is no radical sort of cleavage between the development of these ideas about human worth and dignity, which certainly from the existing sources we have do come primarily through the writings and practice of different religious traditions. But they come to the culture. They are interpreted, they are often challenged, and when you look at, for example, the 16th and 17th century, you had those what were essentially initially Christian ideals really taken up by liberal philosophers and reformers. And then eventually, and sometimes fairly quickly, that link between the idea of a God and this practice got cut off. But it doesn't mean that these antecedents aren't there in the theological traditions of the medieval church and medieval world, for example. So again, just to go back to that earlier point that I was making in reference to Michael, I don't believe that there are these strict binaries between religion and other forms of reflection and discourse. We all have our own convictions. They are shaped by context. They are hopefully internalized and reasoned out and, made our own. But we all have articles of faith, as I say.
Christopher, if you think about the process, I'm curious from your perspective as a philosopher, what's been the $64 million question for philosophers? What have they been trying to ultimately narrow down or identify?
What is the meaning of life? That's the biggest question of all. And we philosophers and all other disciplines have been trying to figure that out for 2,000 years. We started with Plato, and we still study Plato. And here I would take issue with the suggestion that morality has evolved. We can read Plato and we can understand Plato. Plato is talking about the same morality that guides us today. And one of his dialogues is called The Lackeys. And Lackeys is an attempt to define courage. And it's a completely secular discussion. And that suggests that morality has certainly in the Western world, a very familiar basis. That we can still ask, what is the right thing to do? What is the relationship between morality and the meaning of life? Do I need to be a good person to have a meaningful life? These are all questions that we have been asking, and we can look at various answers to these, and we can compare the answers, what might be the problems with the answers. But it's a very real question that we ask our students, and we ask them to think about it in very personal terms. What is the meaning of life for them? And for them to try and articulate what are their values, where do the values come from? Are the values religious? Are the values inherited somehow from their parents, from their culture, from their religion? How do they critically decide whether to adopt or to reject a value? So in that sense, we are not doing theology, we are doing philosophy. However, there's a very close link between philosophy and theology in the academy, in the universities, going back hundreds of years. And we philosophers can certainly take seriously a theologian and their discussion about the meaning of life. And we can certainly have discussions about, for example, institutional corruption. We can look at corruption in the academy, in politics, and in the churches as well. And we can talk with theologians using the same values in those sense.
There's an experiment that's run, I think it was back in 1972 by Professor Walter Mischel in Stanford University, referred to as the Marshmallow Test. And they leave children alone in a room with a hidden camera, and they leave some treats or marshmallow. And they say to them, if you don't eat one of those while I'm out of the room, I'll give you a second one. But what the really interesting part of the experiment is, in many cases, the number of children who will go ahead and eat it when they think nobody is watching and that nobody's looking. That's what I want to explore a little bit further. I mean, if you think about heading down a motorway in Ireland, speed limit 120 kilometres, would anybody go maybe 10% a little bit over because you might get away with it. Michael, what's governing our attitudes to ideas like that?
Well, first of all, I think we all have our innate sense of morality. Each individual has a sense of morality as to what they will do if they are or aren't being watched. The additional part is consequences. And I think what seems to be the case, and certainly in terms of, say, criminal behaviour, is that criminals are less deterred by major consequences and more by the thought of getting caught. So that's the
there's an element of risk
thing.
analysis that people are doing.
Yeah. But I think that brings us on to sort of a wider thing, which again touches on the religious things. Is how do we convince people, more or less on average, to be more caring and more empathetic and compassionate than they would be if they were just looking out for themselves? And the easy answer that religion has used over the years, and not just religion, secular societies have used as well, is authoritarianism. And particularly through religion, because there's an extra psychological impact in religious authoritarianism, which is you're telling people that this is the word of the creator of the universe. And if you get somebody to believe that, that's a very strong motivator, even though it may not be accurate. Now, I would prefer that we work towards a world where we encourage people and enable people to work out what is the best thing to do in a given situation, based on its impact on other sentient beings rather than based on its consequences for itself. Now, it's obviously harder to do that without authoritarianism, but I think it's more valuable if you can do it without authoritarianism.
But very often, some people may remember a little green catechism book that gave us 10 commandments, and that was our starting off point from a religious perspective as to what was right or wrong.
Yeah, and they're shocking commandments. Really, they're terrible. They're the first few are about appeasing the creator of the universe. And the others are largely about protecting the interests of the adult males of one tribe in one part of the world. They treat women as property. They talk about not being unjust to your neighbour, but your neighbour was essentially the members of the tribe. You were encouraged, this God encouraged people to slaughter members of other tribes without mercy. So you have a set of commandments that superficially include a lot of good commands, but actually didn't evolve for that purpose. They evolved to control one tribe at one time, and in a situation where according to the story, that what the God was saying to that tribe is, if you obey my rules, I would help you to kill those people and take their land.
Christopher?
It's very easy to belittle religions by looking at the history of religion and by looking at various obscure parts of the Bible. But I think we should remember something that we might call the religious viewpoint. And your question about the consequences. So here I am, can I get away with eating the marshmallow if nobody's watching? There I am, I've got an eye on the consequences. Can I go a bit faster if nobody's watching? And that leads to a picture of saying that religion is all about authoritarianism and some big police officer in the sky. But that's a very simplistic view of religion. The better view, when we're talking about supervision and consequences, the better view is the novel Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. And here you have somebody who manages to persuade himself that he is superior to other beings, and therefore he is entitled to murder. And he goes ahead with it and suffers the most crushing guilt. And he has no idea where this guilt comes from. He's not blaming God for punishing him. He is slowly, through the 600 pages, coming to realize what he has done. And this awareness is, I would call it, religious. Because it's not about the consequences. He was getting away with it. The police weren't suspecting him. And yet he had this crushing guilt because he gradually became aware that he had killed another human being in cold blood. Where does the guilt come from? We can have stories, a psychological account. We can have anthropological accounts. We can talk about the character Raskolnikov's upbringing. All that's irrelevant. The main point of the novel is that a true moral understanding involves some reference to a higher moral order. And it's that higher-ness, that transcendence of the natural world. That's what I would call religion.
Linda?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christopher has explained that very well. I think that higher moral understanding is really vital. Of course, that higher moral understanding doesn't need to be given a religious terminology, but it is something that is outside of oneself, that has a reference point that is broader than my own individual concerns, and has a concern for the social, the other, as well as me. You know, when I think about this issue of consequences and getting away with something when no one's watching, of course, we all have that instinct that we have to try and fight against. But I was struck a number of years ago reading Michelle Obama's autobiography, and there's a question there which I guess all politicians and many people in authority have to answer. It's does power corrupt? And of course, so that is, does the fact that you can do what you want corrupt the person? And actually what she says is, no, power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals. It reveals one's personality, one's character. Not sometimes, of course, it corrupts it, but I think it's a very important point. That is, if we form our characters and our moral compass through multiple different, from multiple different sources, and if we're attentive to the concerns and interests of other people, then that, I think, is the centerpiece of morality. And whether you give it a religious complexion and character, whether you're motivated by religious ideas and beliefs, or whether you're motivated by other ideas and beliefs, that is, I think, a very personal thing, but it really is extraneous to the issue of how to live a good life and how to form one's moral character.
And that's our Leap of Faith for this week. Thank you to my guests, Professor Linda Hogan, Dr Christopher Cowley and Michael Nugent. On sound this evening was Mark Dwyer, our broadcast coordinator is Jarlath Holland, from our producer Sheila O'Callaghan, and me, Michael Comyn. Good night.